Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast. This is John. Here, the intention and the purpose of this podcast is to talk about the agronomic science and the cultural management practices that have the capabilities of regenerating plant health, regenerating soil health, and ultimately regenerating public health and animal health, because that is, of course, what it's really all about, in addition to regenerating ecosystems and so forth. My guest for this episode is Jay Fuhrer, which I'm very delighted to have here. Jay has had quite an interesting life in the regenerative agriculture space, even before it had that term, helping to lead the demonstrations at the Menoken Farm and also having traveled around the world and spoken with lots of different growers and being able to bring all that information together. So, Jay, thank you very much for being here. I'm delighted to have you.
Thank you, John. I'm looking forward to it as well.
You've had lots of rich experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about your history and pathway and what has brought you to this point and to the work that you're doing today?
I sometimes wonder all those things myself. And sometimes I take a look back at it, and I grew up on a farm that straddled the North Dakota South Dakota state line. And so my dad's farm, which was my grandfather's, it was a homestead farm. We still had the homestead document signed by President Taft at that time. And so it goes back a little ways. Not far when we're talking geologically, but it goes back a little bit for our history. And that gave me kind of an appreciation. My parents were products of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and they both were on farms as children. And so it's what we knew, it's what we did, it's what our relatives did, and altogether, it made up that ag community. And so we kind of grew up in a manner that you helped others. When we got together to complete some work, that made everything go a little easier. And so it was a rich experience when I think back on it, because it included animals. My mother was in charge of the dairy. My dad was in charge of the cropping. He would not allow her on a tractor, and she would not allow him in the barn. And so we learned to work at an early age, and it was the greatest experience on earth, complete with one room schoolhouse. And so my sisters and I would walk to the one room schoolhouse. I was the youngest in the family. By the time I got to the third grade, the one room schoolhouses in the Dakotas were being consolidated, but it gave me a little taste of it. So that was kind of my start. I think from that, I knew I wanted to spend some time in agriculture. And at university, I originally thought my plans were going to be one of maybe in the financial lending world. And so it was kind of my early thoughts on it. I had a background for it academically, but I also had soils background. And so I was so interested in farming in general, and I loved all aspects of it. Even today, something that I've always found difficult to deal with, John, is terms. And maybe it's because of my career in USDA, where we always kind of labeled things, if you will. And I didn't like terms like conservation tillage, because it's so contrary to itself. And it's always been,
It's almost sounds like an oxymoron.
it totally is. And so you think about conservation tillage, and it was always way more about the tillage part than the conservation part. And then we use terms like no-till. Never liked that term, because it was just about one item, one cog on a big sprocket. And so I didn't care much for that term. And then eventually we slowly got to terms like soil health and soil regeneration, which start to encompass this more. So academically, after college, I did take on a career with USDA. You can say a lot of things about the federal government in the United States, but I never really had a bad experience in my entire working career. I always kept the cards on the table face up, and always was allowed to speak my thoughts, and always was allowed to be at the table to help broker some things that could move forward in agriculture's best interest. And so that's kind of how I got started in it. And I had no intentions of staying 40 years with USDA. It just kind of happened. And one thing kind of led to another. And I don't think that's so uncommon. You hear people talk about those things. I certainly experienced that myself. From that, a learning process started that is still going on today. If you allow yourself to, I think you'll learn forever. And I think that's one of our virtues in life. I mean, it's so rewarding. So, but it's kind of how I got started. Yeah, yeah.
The moment you are no longer learning, then it's time to hang up your hat, so to
Well,
speak,
I can't
because
imagine it
you're done.
myself, and maybe it's because I'm a slow learner and I have to go through all these things that maybe other people go through more rapidly. I've found that if I keep my mind open, that these things can happen. And then
Mm.
over time, I like to put them on the ground and observe them. And then we can start to monitor them a little bit and let them paint their picture. But yeah, the learning part is fascinating. And this trail, I think that you've gone down and many others in terms of soil regeneration, there's no apparent destination. The journey is second to none. I mean, it's a fantastic journey.
When we think about journeys, I've asked friends this question sometimes. When you imagine yourself, we sometimes hear the analogy of life being like paddling a boat down a river or paddling a canoe down a river. And so I ask people the question, when you visualize yourself doing this, being on this journey, do you imagine yourself paddling up the river or down
I,
the river? And it's an interesting.
I too have had this vision. When I'm paddling, I'm in an ocean. The vehicle I'm sitting in is very large. And I think it was an analogy of USDA. Because if you're going to change or make movement within an entity of that magnitude, you're going to pedal long and hard and hopefully with a lot of other people. That's how I've kind of envisioned it. I didn't really see it up or down. I just saw it, okay, we're paddling this huge vessel, but we want to move it a little left or right or something like that. Those are the wrong terms in the ocean, I'm sure. But in North Dakota, those are the terms.
So, what bringing this forward to the work of today and for the last decade, how did your work at the USDA lead to the founding of Menoken Farm, and what's the scope of the demonstration work that you're doing there?
That's an interesting part. The first time I ever talked to my colleagues in USDA, I knew there was going to be a meeting and of my peers, and I contacted management and I said I'd like a few minutes on the agenda, and I'd like to talk to them about something that we're looking at pursuing further. And I was politely told that if we get the real work done, we'll give you 5 minutes before lunch. And I said, I'll take it. And so a few minutes before lunch, I got up and I said to my peers, I said, we're looking at, I said, first of all, I'm pretty much done with treating symptoms. I said, I've been building huge amounts of structures, terraces, waterways, diversions, etc. And I said, I don't see the point in this anymore. We're not making any progress on this. It's just treating a symptom. It took me a long time to see it and to figure out some of these things. But with the help of the team, I said we're starting to look at putting together some practices that would be more in line with treating the problem. We're starting to learn about the problem and talk to them a little bit about plant diversity and some of these things that eventually we started to put into place. They were very kind to me. Nobody asked a question. Nobody said anything. And then I had lunch alone that day. And so that was kind of the start of within USDA for myself and within NRCS as an agency, and they were very tolerant of me, but I was starting to lean into paddling real hard on one side of the big ship to make some kind of movement change, and eventually had a lot of colleagues supporting it. And so, but it was a huge change. And I think locally, then we needed a place where we could put cover crops, where we could put different combinations, where we could do some cropping, intercropping. livestock integration, all these things that formulated out of the soil health principles. And the soil health principles were intended to be a starter kit. They were intended to help people like myself. I was a planner. I was a conservation planner. Loved it. And so I spent my career on the end gate of a pickup at the edge of a field and with the client. And I love that atmosphere. And because everything is cards up on the table once the spade goes in the ground, and there's no place to hide. And so you start looking at it and then slowly unraveling. So we needed a place to observe what was going to work in our landscape, what would work in our neck of the woods. And so we wanted a place for that. And if you had to boil it down, John, I'd say we needed a place where we could go to fail and learn and reestablish and reobserve. And it didn't have to be huge. You know, everyone likes to no one likes to fail, but it's the greatest learning experience you'll probably ever have in your life, and you won't have to write it down to remember it. And so I think the Menoken Farm came out of that kind of atmosphere, a place where we could go to put all these things on the ground. And then it became, how do we build back this landscape? We were already very good at dismantling it. So we had that part down. That's where the Menoken Farm, I think, grew out of and how it got its initial start. And I was just associated with it here in Burleigh County. And I was associated with it from the beginning. And it's been the greatest ride imaginable.
What is the scope of the work and the monitoring and the discovery that you're doing at Menoken Farm today?
Well, I think, one of the holy grails in agriculture is, just take something like soil organic matter as a case in point. So in North Dakota, we've been farming approximately, this is probably one of the North and South Dakota, one of the last places that we settled in the U.S. And so you start looking at what have we done in the last 130 years? Well, agricultural wise, from our soils viewpoint, we've removed a good half or better of our soil organic matter. And so you start looking at that. We know how it was built. It was built through very diverse 100 plus species per acre native rangeland and with the animal component. And so we had the large herbivores. We had the bison and numerous other animals, all well documented in North Dakota because of the fur trade and the logs from the fur trade posts. Unbelievable amount of bear, brown bear, black bear, grizzly bear, and on, And then because somebody felt fashion was very important in Europe to have an animal skin on the top of your head, that was pretty much the demise of the beaver in North America. And so change the water hydrology system. And so not to the better. And so we had all these things going on that was kind of animal removal off the landscape, and then it was the prairie removal. So we had 100 plus species being replaced by one species at a time. No cover crops, fairly simple rotations. So we took the complexity away, which I think is kind of a human aspect. It's as human beings, we like to simplify and make something more streamlined, and we call it efficiency. And so I think when we apply that to a landscape, it has some real devastating impacts, but I think it's not an abnormal thing for a human to do. And so we started that process of how do we build it back. So 11 years now with 10 different cropping systems at the Menoken Farm. Took a look the other day and comprised some of that information. So if you just took soil organic matter alone, the interesting thing to me was out of those 10 fields, some of them lost soil organic matter because of what we did on those fields. Okay. So some have control areas on them and some have something we know isn't going to play out well, but it's a demonstration farm. So you let it play out. And then we had others that, have done quite well. And so when I looked at those 10 fields and I said, what's going on here from a soil organic matter? The field that had the largest gains was kind of interesting. because there's an interesting story with it, but it was fields that we had set up 1 year of no-till corn, conventional hybrid. At the Menoken Farm, there's no fungicides or insecticides or commercial fertilizer, but there is herbicide. Okay, and so I looked at that. So it was 1 year of corn for grain, and fall grazed, managed fall grazing, and then the following year was a full season cover crop. Usually for grazing, usually around 10 to 12 species would be normal, somewhere's in there. And then it would be managed grazed, and then back to corn again the third year. And so it had the highest soil organic matter gains. And then, of course, from that, you know where your mind goes. Why don't I take these 2 years and put them together? And let's go with something wider on the corn row, and let's put the cover crop into the corn and fall graze that fall, that winter, and we can accelerate biological time. And so that's the second phase of this that we're in right now. The first phase, it played out alternate years. The new phase for that field will be combining. So what does that do? Does it go up? Does it go down? Does it stay? Let's monitor it out and see what happens. So it's things like that, John, that I think have been so important. They give you this vision of, you can see it play out over time. And I think that's been really helpful.
I find it really intriguing when you go back into the historical agronomy literature during the 60s and 70s. The consensus of the day was that the fastest way to build organic matter was to grow corn. And today we have developed a farming practice where the fastest way to lose organic matter is to grow corn.
Yeah, yeah. I think I look at it this way too, John. There is no such thing as an evil crop. Sometimes we put the crop in an awkward situation. And we've done the same thing with livestock. And there's no evil livestock, but sometimes we put them in an awkward situation. And so I'll give you an example. I have another field. There's 10 fields at Menoken Farm. I have another field that the last 3 years has been in a corn bean full seed coating rotation. So you can do pretty much whatever you want on that field. And so I watched the PLFA, the soil biology. And so out of the 10 fields, my highest PLFA for our regions. Now this is I'm only comparing the 10 fields to themselves for our landscape. So my highest PLFA numbers are 6,000 nanograms. For us, that's high for us. And my lowest is 600. Okay, so I got fields at 6,000. I got fields at 600 for that shot in time that day last fall. Okay, and so when I look at that, then my next question becomes, what about the fungal component? What about the mycorrhizal fungi? What's that doing? So on that field that's at 600 nanograms, I got zero fungi. Okay. And so I look at that, and I look at the ones that are functioning at the much higher worker level, if you will, way more workers and way more diversity of workers. And then I think in terms of what that field has done this previous year. We were in quite a severe drought. We were at about 45% of normal precip. During the growing season early on, we were at about 25%. And then by the end of June, we picked up an inch or two of rain. We're in a 16-inch precip zone totally for the 12-month period. So when you take away about over half of our precip, it gets a little tougher sledding. The ones that had the higher fungal component just didn't realize they were in a drought. And whereas the other ones collapsed quite quickly because we have this man-made acceleration with the drought. So when I look at the fungal component, I just it's so interesting. I think at the end of the day, I said to myself, fungicides are extremely effective.
They really are.
They're extremely effective. And so I've looked at fields where we've just totally removed it within 3 years. Previous to that, it had fungal component, and then it dropped in that 3-year period where we switched to the seed coating with corn bean because I wanted a corn bean field to, well, it's basically a control, and it's basically something to help us know where we're at on the other fields. And so that to me is, if a farmer has that information, he would see this. help us see the puzzle, the picture.
You mentioned earlier that you're using no fungicides and no insecticides, only herbicide applications. Does that mean that on your other example fields that the seeds are not coated, that there are no fungicides or insecticides on the seed?
Correct. As much as possible. Sometimes we have difficulty getting seed. We're not organic, but many times we end up buying organic seed to make this work. And so my normal corn, the cornfield I described earlier, John, that was alternated with a full season cover crop for grazing every other year, that would be a conventional hybrid, no coating.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, you're inferring that the seed coatings with the fungicides are actually what are inhibiting the mycorrhizal fungi and lowering your fungal populations. Is that right?
Well, I took that as probably, it's rarely one thing in agriculture,
Right.
but I took it as probably one of the drivers that is making this more difficult. That particular field also doesn't have cover crops. And so when I take a cover crop out of the scenario, we just lose so much of the carbon exudate. It just isn't occurring, and it's such a short period of time. That first 1 to 2 months of a plant's life that is putting some exudation in the soil before it kind of starts turning around and bringing everything to the grain. But that first 2 months is critical. If we had cover crops, I think we'd find a little stronger recovery in those fields. We're kind of handicapping the field by taking away the cover crop. It's kind of interesting for me because the first time I looked at cover crops, John, the first time I looked at them, I said, "Well, I think they're okay for you, but I don't want them." And and I had to get my head wrapped around what they did. So again, we take them out to a setting like the Menoken Farm. We planted them individually, and then we planted them in combination. And when we started to get into some severe dry conditions, the combinations flourished and produced a nice amount of biomass, whereas the monocultures pretty much dried up. I mean, it just dried up and died. But then we took a backhoe, of course, and we're in North Dakota now, so we got to find out here. So we took a backhoe and we dug across all the plots. And it's so interesting to observe the root mass in that 4 foot deep trench and the connection and the combinations, connection of all the plants. So it's a learning environment. But then I got to the point where I said, okay, they're important. And then I got to the point where I said, okay, I think they're essential. I just don't think I'm going to build this thing back without them.
Yeah.
And so yeah, yeah.
When you consider this being a demonstration farm, you've mentioned that you pulled PLFA analysis. What is the scope of the monitoring work that you're doing on each of these plots? How are you evaluating how the system is evolving over time?
Well, we use a combination of things. My favorite is the spade. A lot of times we say, oh, this is what you really want to use. Well, when a farmer first starts that process, he doesn't really have anything to compare it to. So he puts the spade in the ground and goes, okay, there it is. Well, okay, but what is that? What can I compare that to in relation? And so we've removed most of the native grasslands in so many of our states in the US. They have little to no grasslands left. So that element's usually not available to them. But maybe a fence line is. And so if I'm working with a farmer and we're starting this process, we'll put the spade in the ground. I'll let him pick out a so-called average field. I don't want his best producing. I don't want his worst producing. Bring me something that's kind of middle of the road and kind of dominant to a degree in size. And so we'll check out the fence lines, and if we have grasslands, we can do that. And then all of a sudden, this whole spade thing starts to evolve a bit more. And then my second item I'll do with starting with the new farm is I'll take out my aluminum rings and I'll do some infiltration. And I like to put if I'm going to record it, I like to use about 5 rings and inch of water, and I'll throw out the high and the low and average the remaining 3 is what I typically do as a starting point. Now, keep in mind, these are 2 big items that I think can tell us a lot, and I haven't spent a penny yet. I don't spend money till it's necessary. Upbringing again, but so we look at that, and then I like to dig those rings out and flip them over upside down and shave them off, and see if they are uniformly wet all the way across. So there's a lot we can do just with infiltration. Now we got mollisol soils. I should be able to hold 8 to 9 inches of water in a 4-foot profile in a mollisol. And if I start to look at this where we actually improve the carbon levels, I'll hold more yet. And so we start to get a bigger bucket to hold water, as we say. We make it larger. And so this has been, kind of a starting point. And then if I can have a starting point for PLFA, I like that because it kind of, again, tells you what you got. And then also, if we're going to do something and work together, I like to archive the soils. So I'll take some soil, put it in a bucket with a lid, and pop a couple holes in it and label it. And put it on the bottom, put it on maybe underneath the bench in the workshop, and forget about it for a few years, but invariably go back to it. It's fascinating to go back to it. And so, those are some starting points. PLFA, we've used the Haney analysis for a number of years after it came out. I also did through USDA. I followed up with a few different farmers for a 3-year trial on Haney analysis when it first came out. And so I had some background with it and then started applying it to the Menoken Farm as well. And I thought it definitely brought some things to the table from the viewpoint of inorganic and organic, where we could get a much better look. And so I appreciated that. So all of these collectively, they started to evolve. On the livestock end, nutritional balancer, man, what a tool that's been. So I can see how those critters are doing. I've done a fair bit of work on grazing systems over the years and have a bit of a passion for it. And the grazing system, if we don't have breed back, we don't have a long relationship with that rancher. You got to have a high conception rate in the ranching industry, or you're not going to go very far on that. And so that has to do with fat on the animal and body condition scores. And so just another example. And virtually every plant, every cover crop I've broken half over the years by weight and sent them in, top half, bottom half, to look at the difference in protein and energy between the two. And so we start to get an understanding that top half by weight, again, that's okay for the critter, but the bottom half by weight, the job of that critter is to trample it to the soil surface. We have to have it trample. And so, you start collectively bringing different tools. To me, there's never really a magical bullet. Mm-hmm. But if we have enough information, it starts to help us paint that picture. But, John, so many times, sometimes we'll have groups come through and somebody will say, well, I want to reduce fertility. Well, I said, look at these 10 fields. Look at the biology on each of these 10 fields, just at the Menoken Farm. Could you pick one out that if you reduced, and let's just say it was 10, let's call them 10 farms, okay? And it's their average PLFA on the 10 farms, okay? And could you pick one out, sir, that would mean you'd likely fail? And can you pick one out that means you got a good shot at making something happen? Yeah, he said, I can. He said, I can look at that. And he said, I can see where if I have no fungi and I got a really low starting point on the biology, I got to maybe approach that a little differently than a field that has such a high amount of each, relatively speaking. And so it helps guide us a bit and take away some of that risk factor. And listening to your own presentation the other day at No Till on the Plains, I saw some similarities in your approach on what you've done so many times with your clients. And so but you've got some background information. You know certain things that help guide this process. So
it's always best not to guess about things that it's possible to measure.
well, and also, you're working with somebody's livelihood.
Exactly.
And I take that extremely seriously. I'll give you an example. When we started with cover crop combinations, 2006, throughout the use of the Menoken, that was actually prior to the Menoken Farm, but we had a little tiny Menoken Farm at that time. It was like 5 acres, and then eventually it became 150. But even then, Ademir Keligari, the crop consultant out of South America, I listened to his presentation, and I remember thinking, wow, we got so much time where our sunlight is just hitting bare ground. It's not hitting a green plant. I know it's North Dakota, but I think we could do this. It's just finding the how, finding the fit, and modifying some things to fit your landscape. And so we started those combinations, and what a learning experience they were. Such a difference in soils. And yeah, absolutely.
When you have been conducting these PLFA analysis and looking at infiltration rates and doing all these types of assessments over the years, what has really stood out for you? What was unexpected?
I think what was unexpected initially, John, was that we had become so accustomed to a degraded soil that this is how it is. And this is how they function.
We've accepted a new normal.
I know we did within USDA. I mean, we just thought this is how it is. And I remember my first visits with the soil scientists that were working on web soil survey, for instance, that we need to include soil health in web soil survey. And I won't say they laughed me out of the room, but it might have been close to something like that. I think they politely waited until I walked down the hallway. But the initial discussions didn't go well. As time went on, uh, this started to change. And if you go on to Web Soil Survey today, keep in mind now this is the largest natural resource database in the world. Okay, so there is huge amount of information in it, and more coming. And so the interesting thing to me was this was the start of the process. And but of now, you go into Web Soil Survey to now today, you're going to find the soil health section. Okay, and so this was a great start, I think, internally. And so we didn't think that soils were. I'm speaking for myself now. We didn't think that there was going to be this huge change, but the change was beyond anything I imagined. And so I was used to putting structures in on these soils. I was accustomed to these soils. And then one day I said to myself, once we had some systems on the ground, we had some cover crops on the ground, we had a little managed grazing with them. I saw some interesting, observed some interesting things. So one of the things I observed was if we were in a runoff area to a pond, it lowered the level of the pond. So now all of a sudden, our ponds, our dugouts, our dams, if you will, that were for livestock, somewheres on the farm, the elevation levels lowered. Even the wetlands went back into their banks, maybe even a little smaller, because our water now was being used in the profile. And instead of evaporating water, normally in North Dakota, you manage your water with tillage. And so it would evaporate, you till, and it would evaporate, and it wasn't managed through transpiration. And so this was a whole different scenario because now we were running our water through transpiration instead of evaporation. And so we were hydrating our soils and we were covering them. And the difference it made when you'd put a spade in the ground, and to this day, I still marvel at it. But when I look at a well aggregated soil, it's like, wow. I mean, this I know, maybe I need more of a life, but that's exciting. When I see that occur, when I see that occur on the profile with the farmer, I had a client here, this is a number of years ago, but the first time he observed, made some changes, added all these items, and then observed the first time ever earthworms in his fields. He almost dug up the entire field, with the spade, just looking at them because it was so exciting. And so I don't think we envisioned, I don't think we saw this coming. I don't think I think soil degradation is so subtle. I think that's one of the reasons why it's brought down so many civilizations over time when we look back historically. I think that's one of the aspects.
It's a classical example of being the frog in the water when it heats up slowly because it
Right,
does happen
exactly.
slowly. And I think I've many times mentioned the aspect that we have forgotten what really healthy plants look like anymore. And what you're saying is we've forgotten what really healthy soil looks like anymore. And I'm always so intrigued and impressed and amazed at how rapidly these systems recover. When you think about all the degradation that has been inflicted on many of these ecosystems, they're incredibly resilient and they come back so quickly. It's a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's where the excitement is. You know, this is going back in time a little bit, but I was involved in highly erodible land. 1985, the highly erodible land legislation came about through the Farm Bill, and NRCS is charged with implementing Farm Bill. So I was working on implementing HEL plans. Okay, and very short period of time. And our mode at that time in the 80s was full tillage, no cover crops, no livestock integration, and limited crop diversity. Okay, tough landscape, lots of erosion. And so we went ahead and we did those plans, and it was very controversial. Every day was really a difficult day because there was huge pushback, you know, regarding this conservation planning effort on HEL in this really short period of time. Okay, and so I got a good look at that end of the spectrum where you're going to force it, if you will. Okay, and then such an interesting thing, once we moved into soil regeneration with the same group of people, very same farmers, it was a more of a, we better have a cup of coffee at the table and talk through this a little bit, and then we'll go to the field and we'll look at all this and we'll see where we're going, and we'll write out these goals and where we want to try to go. And it was a huge reversal. You know, I've been fortunate in my career, I guess that's fortunate, to be able to look at both ends of that and see both ends of it. And so we can go ahead and pass legislation, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen on the land in the manner that it's looked at on paper. Okay. And or we can do something more constructive and we can build. So my point is, when you are have soil regeneration, it's exciting, and the landowner's excited, you're excited. It's building something, and not only that, but it's building in the right direction. Whereas if you go off on the other end of it, it's a tough uphill battle that I don't think ever really materializes on the ground.
I've come to the conclusion that regeneration, or perhaps I should use the word transitioning to a different form of agriculture doesn't really happen in the field. Happens first in our hearts and minds. And that's the difficulty with forcing an approach using legislation.
Yeah, yeah. You can't put it into every client's mind magically. You know, there's a process, and there's a trust factor, and there's a team factor, and there's a, I think both you and the client understanding each other of what's in your mind and your heart and your soul to that degree. I think those things are important that have to happen somehow.
Jay, you've had a lifetime of experience, and over that lifetime have developed perhaps a different perspective on agriculture than what is commonly considered the mainstream view, or at least what was the mainstream view of very few short years ago. What is something that you believe to be true or that you have a different perspective on than the mainstream view?
When I look at and I'm gonna join and team up with a farmer somewhere. Doesn't matter where. I'm gonna do a little homework, and I'm gonna start with the geology. And so I want to know what the geology landscape looked like. And I'm going to just use as an example the Northern Plains here because it's where I've spent my career and where I'm comfortable. I'm going to give you an example. Let's just take the Missouri River. Missouri River used to run to the Hudson Bay. And so it drained, all of North Dakota drained to the Hudson Bay. Okay. And then one day we had these things called glaciers come through, and they decided, no, that's enough of that. We're going to change some of this. And so now the Missouri River was forced to go south. And so I want to know how this was. I want to know if you had glaciers, because they restart our soils. And so in North Dakota, we've been fortunate. We've received a lot of soil assistance from Canada geologically over time. Okay. And so there's a big difference when a soil has been either volcanoes or in this particular case, a glacier, whether they've had that impact or not. And so there's parts of the U.S. that have, there's parts that haven't. And some have had very little. In our situation here, they're estimating, but it's probably at least a half a dozen times, if not more, over geological time. That's a huge starting item there, because if I've got a soil like a mollisol that's been glaciated a number of times, I got something pretty good to start. So I want to know what happened from the geology viewpoint. And in the last 10,000 years, we know that, yeah, it got populated with native grass plants, and in our area, huge amounts of animals, especially the bison. And so we know this occurred, and we know that built these soils, and that gave us a huge start. And then we know we've simplified it. So what was it? Approximately 1871 through 78, right in there, we decided that the bison have to go, and so they were taken out in a very short period of time. A really interesting book on that is it's called The Buffalo Harvest by Frank Meyer, and there's a lot of romantic thoughts about the bison herds and all this. He probably does a better job of factually telling us what was on the landscape. It's a brutally honest book, and he himself shot huge amounts of them. And so it was an interesting book to read, how they behaved, always in smaller groups, etc. And then after the buffalo were taken out, I always kind of suspected this, but I never could really find the right book. He talks in there about the group that came in behind him. So the group that came in behind him was the group that put cyanide and strychnine on all the carcasses and took out the wolves, took out the coyotes, took out that whole entire group. And so then after that came the people with the wagons and hauled the bones off, and they were shipped east and used for fertilizer and sugar refinement and different things. And so now I'm starting to understand, okay, and now I'm starting to understand my process here and what happened geologically a little bit, and then what happened before pre-European settlement. And I think another thing that helps me understand is with the European settlement, colonization, what does that term mean? You know, when I was in grade school, that term to me meant we just magically came here and nobody else was here evidently, and we said, okay, we're going to go ahead and start farming here. You know, it probably wasn't quite like that. So if you read the history of colonization, it's kind of a brutal one, coming out of what European countries probably considered a bit of a necessity because they had outgrown their surroundings a bit. But Cecil Rhodes would be a classical one that would come to my mind. If you read his quotes, they're brutal. Colonization to him meant you went to another country, you took its resources by either enslaving or forcing the local people to move those resources to your country, and then you would bring back anything you didn't want, or even people you didn't want. That's colonization in a little bit more of a brutal form. It's a little more than what I grew up in grade school learning. And so you look at that entire scenario. So we kind of went in with that mindset, and we started taking these resources, the animal resource, and then we took the prairies out, and Bonanza Farms again in North Dakota. So the Bonanza Farms produced some really nice yields, and with time, eventually they were then decreased, but then they were sold off to individuals in small parcels. So that's a business plan that only made money, but it made money by extracting from the landscape again. And so we understand some of these things that occurred, and then we understand how do we build it back. And so if we know how it was built, it's so helpful to know how to reconstruct. So then you look at all that and you go, okay, I'm going to put a cover crop on. Well, am I going to put a monoculture, or am I going to put a polyculture, or what am I going to do here? Am I going to hay it off? Am I going to graze it? What's going on? So you look at that, and then you say to yourself, here's an opportunity to lean into diversity. So if I'm going to put a cover crop in my environment here in the Northern Plains, I'm probably going to try to shoot for a pretty good size polyculture, something reasonable with the means I have to do it and the labor I have to do it. But it would tell me why I why I want to go and lean into this diversity. I had 100 plus species. Why would it be odd if I put in 8 or 10 on a cover crop?
It seems odd that you would only put in 8 or 10.
Yeah, we had a client in the county who I think one day went up to 50. And so you find your comfort zone. When I looked at that, these are all things. So then when if we're going to bring in livestock, do I want to put them out on a quarter section, or do I want to put them into a smaller area and move them more frequently? Well, again, I look at what built the soils and the animal populations that were dense and then long periods of recovery. The one thing we know about bison is they probably did something different every year. That one I can agree on with everybody. But we know we had this animal impact. Okay. So let's bring in that animal impact. So we go back and we look at what happened geologically and pre European with all of our, we got Lewis and Clark journals and we got all of these. We just have to read them. If I took a less than an hour walk, I'm at the Missouri River here, and that's where they were. And so it's relative. It's relative to here. And they described that when they were between Pierce, South Dakota, and Bismarck, North Dakota, when they were in that that particular vicinity, the interesting thing was they said at a single glance they would see thousands of animals at a single glance. Now that's hard for us to envision. It's a well documented journal. And so you look at all those and you build this process back. And I think when I look at a field, I think about landscape, I think about all of these things that have occurred or likely have occurred. I want to find out as much as I can about that before I start looking at it today, directly today and tomorrow. And so then I have a much better feel for what may be obtainable and maybe how to obtain it even. And I think that's just part of my process of what I look at, but I like to start geologically.
When you spoke about colonization, it occurred to me that we can have a conversation about colonization on two different levels with the quote that you provided from Cecil Rhodes. What occurred to me is that colonization doesn't just occur of other civilizations, but it also occurs of nature, that we are today extracting a lot from nature and putting the things we don't want back into nature as well. So that mindset hasn't shifted yet.
I think when we get to the point where, well, I think we should look at what our own goals are. I have a personal goal at work, had nothing to do with USDA, it had nothing to do with anything else. But my personal goal was I wanted to be able to farm forever. That's just a personal goal. Okay. So when I connect with another person or entity, that goal is in the back of my mind, and I like them to know my goal so that they're not surprised by whatever. Here's the scenario. And so I think, my parents taught me an appreciation for everything that's alive. I'm going to give you an example. Okay. My mother was in charge of the dairy. All right. Her goal, every milk cow should die on that farm. That was her goal. Wasn't my dad's. He wanted to get them in a truck while they were still upright. But her goal was that cow should have a long, productive, stress-free life, and it should die on that farm. Then I think you start looking at so many things differently. And I think if you have an appreciation for life, and there's so many more things that you and others are bringing to light, that how this life interrelates and how it functions, and all of that starts to come together a bit more. And I think that helps us even further appreciate it. When we first put cover crops in, I'm going to tell you something strange about a cover crop. It's not really strange, but I mean, it's not what you would read in a cover crop manual. Okay. At the Menoken Farm, we always have a cover crop combination, one full season, because the groups come any time of year, and when they come, they want to see a cover crop. So I generally have one field rotated through. It's going to be full season cover crop. I noticed that if I was having a stressful day somewheres, not that you ever would, working for USDA. But I would stop at the Menoken Farm and I would get out and I would walk into that cover crop and I would close my eyes and I would listen and I would smell and I would just feel it. And it's like it just was kind of a little helpful to me. And then when the groups started coming through, that started in 2009. I've seen groups do almost anything in those cover crop combinations. I've seen them lay down in them. I've seen them take selfies. I've seen their group pictures taken in there. I've seen them all kneeling and sitting down in there and talking to each other. It's a strange. Maybe it isn't strange, but we're not used to seeing that. How many times do you see that in a corn bean field? Probably not too many times. But in a cover crop with all of the color and all of the sound and all of the connection going on, and the insect world, which then brings the bird into it as well. And so you have all these birds flying in the field, you have all these insects, you have all this sound, you have all these pollinators. And I think it's kind of like a message of hope. We can build this back, and we can accelerate biological time a little bit with the combinations. We can, like you mentioned, we can make this happen quicker. So much came to light from 40 years ago. There was no conversation on liquid carbon exudation. We knew there was carbon in the grain. We knew there was carbon in the residue. We knew there was carbon in the root mass. We knew that. Okay. And on a corn plant, it's mathematically about a third, a third, a third. The missing part was this liquid part, which is, and I've read a fair bit of research on it. It's more difficult to put a specific number on it, that a plant gives up 30% or 40% of its photosynthetic energy that goes to this. So there's a range. It's usually listed in ranges. Okay. And so, but there was no thought given to that this would build our soil organic matters back. I mean, there was no conversation on this. This all occurred much, much more recently, within the last 20 years, for instance, or even less. And so a lot of people helped bring this to light and illustrated it well. And then when we started gaining soil organic matter, well, the first conversations, John, were, well, that's not possible. In our environment, Northern Plains environment, you cannot gain 0.1 a year. It's impossible. Can't do it. Okay. And then they would send you the math of why you can't do it. And it would be purely on the decompositional part of soil organic matter in terms of the plant. Okay. And nothing in terms of liquid carbon exudates, etc. When this first started occurring, it was like, yeah, that can't be. But then somebody else made it happen. Then somebody else made it happen. And then after a while, others stepped into it further that had some backgrounds in it and put some pieces together. And we've just gained so much information over the years. It's been very helpful.
I think that's happening more and more with growers accomplishing things or producing results in soils that aren't supposed to be theoretically possible with our current understanding, both in terms of gaining organic matter, but also as we regenerate the carbon cycle. Partnered with that is included the regeneration of the nitrogen cycle if we manage it well and don't disrupt it. And we have worked with growers whose soils are gaining hundreds of pounds of hundreds of pounds of nitrogen per year, and that isn't supposed to be possible. And yet the data and the evidence suggests that it is. So we have to revise the theories to fit the facts.
I think, John, that's where you would hear people say something like, well, they made some changes and they've observed some things. And one thing they realize is 1 + 1 is no longer 2.
Yeah.
And I think, what we've seen is really, I think when I look back at it, the more degraded the soil was, the more it responded to our earlier efforts of traditional fertility management and those type of things. As the soil, as we mentioned a little earlier, as the soil started to improve and you brought life back into that soil, it started behaving totally different. And again, was not accustomed to that.
I've come to the conclusion that in biological systems that are well managed, 1 + 1 more frequently equals 11 than 2.
Yeah, it's somewhere's in there, and I think we have to be prepared for that. That there can be a bit of something that occurs exponentially that used to occur in increments at best, and so yeah, totally different aspect.
I'd like to go back to your description of the way people felt and responded to these multi-species cover crops. This is something that I can personally relate to very well on both ends of the spectrum. Sometimes I walk into a field that I want to turn around and run away, and and sometimes you walk into a field that has this really welcoming and calming effect, and that's essentially what you're describing as well as this calming field of being in an ecosystem that is, for lack of a better term, it's comfortable and it's happy.
It's one of our senses. Sometimes my colleagues would give me a bad time because I always like to smell a soil, and I can tell a bit because I'm accustomed to doing that. So it was one of my tools I used as to help me find out where it was at. And so whether you smell it, see it, feel it, sometimes we need to use our senses because we're all connected on this thing. When we look at that, and I've had the same experience, I go into a field and I see it. I see the surface rather sealed off. You can kind of see that immediately. You put the spade in the ground, and I can't. I have a lot of trouble getting my spade in the ground. And I look at the root mass, and there's a lot of J rooting, and this is a tough environment. It's never seen a cover crop. It's never seen surface residue. It's never seen anything. That's your starting point, and now we want to work some magic on this field. And so you start looking at that, but that feeling that you have in your stomach, I think, is your biology telling you that this is a difficult task, and this is not. I don't even want to really be in the field. I want to be someplace else. I've had that experience. I've also had the experience of being on farms where I just didn't want to leave it. It just felt right,
Yeah,
and there were so many good things happening. What we have happened so many times, I think, is we have farms like that unravel something. Maybe it never got raveled or unraveled. Maybe they were just able to maintain what grandpa did or what dad did, and it was already on the right road. But anyway, it was a farm that was functioning at a high level. Don't even really care to move, to leave that farm. And so you feel that connection, and that's the feeling of hope, I feel,
yeah.
because then you can go to another field. And I've never worried about how large or small a farm was. If I was going to work on it, it didn't matter to me what the size of the farm was, because I knew even on that large farm, if we get one field done correctly, that's the big item. That's the important one. After that, I think then it becomes much easier to look at it on a larger scale. So I would always start with a field. Let's go ahead and change this. Let's do some monitoring so we know what the before is, and then we got some idea on an after, and we know if we're making some progress. But I can sense when that feeling is good, and so many times the family goes right. The family is good. They seem to go together. And not that there's any evil plants or anything like that, but you can feel when that soil is functioning right. You can smell it. You can feel it. You can do all these things.
The entire ecosystem is happy. That's the simple way of saying it.
I think so. And I got one other observation I want to share with you on that. And it was the very first time that I was with a rancher, and we had put on a full season cover crop on one of his fields. That winter, he was going to winter graze. Okay. And so he was kind of known to have a little bit wilder cattle. They were used to a plane or helicopter over their backs, as far as seeing where they were at. And so they were they spooked fairly easily, is what he told me. Well, anyway, the cattle came into that field that day. We're standing out there in our Carhartts and our snow boots, and there's a bit of snow on the ground, and those cattle are coming in and they're grazing these cover crops. We just stood there, and eventually, and there was a few hundred head there, and eventually they just kind of surrounded us somewhat, and they just were milling around, grazing, and extremely calm. And the rancher looked at me and he says, "I don't think these are my cows." one of the best lines ever. So the same thing I think was happening with his cattle.
Yeah.
They had a lot of diversity to choose from, and it was winter. They're good at grazing in the winter, and so they were in their element that day, and they felt this calmness. I felt it. I could feel it. I think the rancher felt it. But the cattle were so calm, and they just kept coming closer and closer to us. They made no never mind to us. They'd walk right by us within a few feet, and it was just like we were part of the herd.
Jay, we live in a very different informational world than we did even 3 or 5 years ago in the terms of the conversation around regenerative agriculture. There's so much information available today that was a lot harder to get longer ago. So I'd like to kind of bring clarity and focal points for all of us to follow up on. What is something that you wish all farmers knew?
The first thing that would probably come to my mind that would be, but it kind of goes back to that starter kit. It goes back to the soil health principles. And for me, I've worked with them for many years. And if all farmers felt comfortable with them and felt they could install them, that knowledge, uh, I would love to have everybody have that knowledge. I think there wouldn't be much reason or need for people in my position because I think they can do this. And I would like to see that happen directly. I think if we could have farmers understand that process. I had an email this morning I replied to was from a Montana farmer this morning. He's an organic producer and told me what he grew and some of his objectives, and he's looking for a support group. And so I sent him an email back and I recommended one to him. Also sent him some additional information regarding soil health principles, etc., maybe some starting points. And what kind of bothers me a little bit in agriculture, and I know it always did in USDA again, are these labels. Because he said, well, he's organic. Okay. I've seen some of the best and worst organic systems you can imagine. I've seen some of the best and worst no-till systems you can imagine. I've seen some of the best and worst conventional. I don't care what you put on them. If your carbon levels are, if you're having an uptick in carbon levels and your soils show all this, I don't really care what you call that system. I think we have to get past the label sometimes and be able to look at that system because we've had people that have done some just unbelievably great things on how they've approached it. And each group has something the other group doesn't have. And we start putting these labels on. I don't know that they do us any good. I like diversity of systems because I think today we really don't know which of these systems is going to probably prove the most helpful in moving us to some other higher plane. And so I think it's good that we have different systems in place. If we were all just one system, I think we don't learn as quickly. There's more to be gained this way. But if we could bring in, so when a group comes to the Menoken Farm, I don't try to talk them into anything. I'm going to show them what we've done with soil health principles and that they can find something to take home and implement. That, is more the goal. How can we go ahead and take your system and bring it up to a higher function? Whatever change they want to make is up to them, but I think that kind of information gives them a place to go. It also has to be a safe environment. And by that, I mean when a group comes, whatever they say, whatever they want to talk about, however controversial it is, let's just talk through it and let's leave it right there at the farm. And so it needs to be a safe environment. And I think not everybody feels that way on every topic. I don't think they always tell us their real thoughts unless the situation is right. And that's when I think we can really make some progress is when they feel comfortable to do that.
Jay, I love the thoughts that you just shared because there is an element here of course, connecting with peer groups and support groups at events like touring a farm or field days and conferences and so forth. And I believe there's also a need for us to do that in an online environment as well, which is why I started kindharvest.ag. In my experiences working with many different growers and agronomists and mentors, it becomes abundantly clear very quickly that everyone, every single person, knows something that I can benefit from. I just need to figure out what it is that they know that I would like to know. And when we recognize that each one of us has that a unique set of experiences or knowledge or wisdom that others can benefit from, of course, it's up to each of us to share that freely and put it out there because and recognizing that what we get back is going to be orders of magnitude bigger than what we put out.
Every time we gain a little more information, I mean, it just helps the entire situation overall. It makes everything stronger.
Yep.
That sharing environment, and I think when if we're willing and our minds are open,
Yep.
um, I think there isn't a farmer out there. So many times, what I've seen, John, is some farmer somewheres figured something out, and he's got this thing working. Okay, and I think what happens a lot of times, I think eventually, research unravels the why on that.
Yep.
But an innovative farmer, because they're strongly innovative from the viewpoint of financial success and these type things, when we can bring that to play. But many times I've seen the start of something, it started on some farmer's farm, some field, somewheres, either by accident or by well thought out process. Either one's good. And then how do we take that and look at it? Yeah.
Jay, you mentioned the importance and the value of having a safe environment to be able to have conversations that some might consider to be controversial. What is a topic that you would desire to speak more about, but you often don't because you sense that people may not be ready to hear it?
Well, there's a few things. One of them that's been near and dear to my heart, and I've had a number of conversations with, is taking our remaining in the Dakotas, taking our remaining native rangeland out and converting it to cropland. And I struggle with that because we lose quite an acreage. I'll give you an example. Just in this county alone, this county is 1 million acres in size. There's about 300,000 acres of native rangeland in it, approximately. Okay. And that number gets smaller every year. So every year we're taking some of that out. An ecosystem like that, when you walk on this native rangeland, especially in May and June, it's like a flower garden. So with all of the forbs and all of the warm season grasses, cool season grasses, legumes, flowering forbs, etc., that's an ecosystem that, in my opinion, around the world is second to none, positively second to none. You can talk rainforest or any other system you want. This native rangeland is an ecosystem that we should want to maintain into the future. As you remove it off the landscape, as more and more of those acres come off the landscape, it puts an extreme burden on the remaining livestock industry, cow-calf industry in our world here, more so. And it removes that plant diversity. And I don't care if you try to seed it back or not. Eventually, a lot of times, you'll hear people talk about seeding it back. It's never quite the same. It's never as diverse. Geological time put those plants there, and that high diversity of plants. And when that's gone, just classical case in point, I think I read one time Minnesota has something like less than 2% native grasslands left in the state. I think it was actually less than that. I see no reason to get to that point because that starts to collapse the landscape. I've talked many times about this topic within my office to people that were transitioning. I think the people that were transitioning it saw it as a niche or a way in to the farming world, if you will. So they could buy something less than cropland price, okay, and they could make this change and high carbon available in it. So it's a great start out of the gate. But then we're repeating our simplification of the landscape.
We're repeating our colonization.
Yes, we've now colonized that quarter section or complete section of native rangeland. which I have a lot of difficulty with personally. I mean, it's a very important item, I feel. And I think if we could bring that diversity forward, along with that, it was an island of safe haven for the insect world because most of our cropland fields are no longer have safe haven areas in them. So we used to have a lot of tree windbreaks in North Dakota. They were put in the 50s and 60s for wind erosion in our cropping systems at the time. Those are being taken out and not being replaced. And the abandoned farmsteads are being taken out. So it's the simplification of the landscape. So we don't have these safe haven areas. So I had this Canadian farmer send me an email, I think it was last fall, and he said, on my farm, he said, I'm putting up an area of a few acres in the middle of every quarter. And he said, on there, he said, I planted them to native grasslands, and he said I've set bales, and he said I've done various things on there, and he said I've gone to the local cemetery in the area that hasn't been used yet because it's on one of the few places that has grasslands, and he said yes, I did take some soil from it, and I've inoculated that little area with some of that soil, and he said I've done this on each of my quarters of land. I sent him an email back and I said, it sounds like you've set up an island on each of them to foster life. And he said, yeah, this started the start of my rebuilding process. And so here we are taking out these native grassland areas. And so that's a near and dear item. I've talked it before, but not to the point of action where you maybe have a plan of action of something you're trying to achieve on it. It's a difficult one.
I have a question on these native grasslands. If we manage them with the knowledge and the technology that we've developed over the last decades with intensively managed rotational grazing and so forth, if we were to manage those as thoughtfully and carefully as we do our crops, wouldn't we be able to produce the same or higher levels of meat per acre than we are with grain crops, let's say, for example?
The native rangelands have all of that capability. And they have a continual harvest of CO2 because they're cools and warms, and they bring that to the entire spring, summer, fall scenario. And so many positives are happening with it. It's all water transpiration. We have very little evaporation on them, so it's a very efficient system. But yeah, when we manage them, when we take a look and apply management like what produced them, manage them like the bison had a tendency to do, things change on them, and we start to see them respond to that. Yeah, there's no question, John. And we have a lot of people that have done that, and they're good at it, and they become one with that operation. But as a whole, the big total continues to decline. That's a concern. I think one other item that I was going to mention too, when we're talking transition, um, Dwayne Beck has put a transition plan together for moving from what I would consider old sunshine carbon fossil fuel inputs at Pier to new sunshine carbon. And so changing that whole transitional thing on how to run a farm in terms of carbon, et cetera. And so moving from purchased inputs more to a management scenario. And I think that's another transition item on a farm, transitional plans that look into the future on this same item. There's a couple of things that I've done some work on them, but not to the point where I can say I got up and said, look, guys, here's what's going on here. So I think that's kind of on the horizon a bit more in our environment here. So many states don't have that native rangeland anymore. That's gone.
It's really interesting when you think about the American Southwest, for example. There's stories of people riding through the what is today the desert Southwest, talking about or writing. They wrote about the potential of a horse and a rider getting lost in the tall grass prairies because the grasses were so tall. And today it's a desert.
Yeah,
That's 150 years ago.
yeah. When man's involved, we can simplify it to the point that desertification takes place, or we can go ahead and change this and then start applying things in that particular landscape that we know are what built it. And I think we can reverse that. We can change that. But yeah, I've seen those same things right here. We aren't in a desert scenario here, but we still see the big impacts. It's loss of production, it's loss of plant diversity, and we removed all the animals, and we don't want to put them back. It's lifestyle changes and all these things that come into play as human beings.
Jay, thank you very much for being here and for sharing your knowledge. I look forward to having many more conversations with you in the future.
Well, I think, we've kind of gone down some similar roads, and it's interesting. I think if I could do anything in life, it would be to go back with maybe a younger body and, start this situation with a little bit more insight. I was truly a babe in the woods, and it was so much of it was a self-taught and learning process, but a process that I wouldn't give up for anything. I mean, it's the greatest ride in the world.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.